Through the Treaty of Versailles, the British Empire had acquired 800,000 square miles of new territory and 13 million new subjects in Arabia, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, so that King George V ruled the largest empire in the history of mankind. In the age of the new Imperium, it was possible to travel from Cape Town to Alexandria, to British Columbia, to Newfoundland, to England, and from England to Gibraltar without passing from the shadow of the Union Jack. It was also possible to go by rail from Cape Town to Cairo without once leaving British territory. And that, it seemed, was not the end of British acquisitions. Even as the Bolshevik Civil War was going on in Russia, the British were displaying interest in vast areas of North Russia. On a Field of Red, the Communist International, and the Coming of World War II by Anthony Cave Brown and Charles B. MacDonald. New York, G. P. Putnam Sons, 1981, page 179-80. The Treaty of Aachen, signed in 1668, was supposed to keep the French Catholics out of Holland, and Belgium belonged at the time to the Spanish Catholics, and Parliament wanted war with Catholic France, but Charles II made a secret Treaty of Dover with the King of France, Louis XIV, on the 1st of June in 1670, and he had the help of John Churchill of Marlborough to enact the secret treaty. Charles II promised to help Catholic France fight the Protestant Dutch in the secret treaty, and in the Second Dutch War, Charles II captured New Amsterdam and renamed it as New York, in honor of his brother James II, who would become the last Catholic King of England. And New York was named after James when he was still the Duke of York, before he became James II. The French produced the signed secret Treaty of Dover document, and the man who wrote it was locked up in the Tower, which was the first time Parliament had ever done such an uppity thing against the King of England. And because Parliament continued to agitate for war with France, Charles II dissolved Parliament. The next Parliament was even worse, so Charles II dissolved it again in 1679, and after a few months the King would dissolve it for the third time. And the new Parliament voted that the King was not allowed to dissolve Parliament without its consent, so Charles II dissolved Parliament for a fourth time a few days later, and would rule without a Parliament until his death in February of 1685 at the age of 54, but he might have been poisoned. Charles II's younger brother James II became king in 1685, and James II and his first wife had two daughters named Mary and Anne. And James II was a Catholic sympathizer, so right away a cabal of English noblemen drew up the House of Hanover plot to prevent a Catholic from ever sitting on the throne of England again. When Parliament had been cracking down on Catholics under the Catholic at heart Charles II, a cabal had emerged to counter Parliament, and the word cabal came from this secret group of lords whose first letters spelled Cabal, for Clifford, Arlington, Buckingham, Ashley, and Lauderdale, and Ashley would later become Lord Shaftesbury. This cabal had been meeting since the days of the Barons' Rebellion in 1215, when these Cabalists forced John I to sign the Magna Carta. The Cabalists forced John I to sign the Magna Carta, and the cabal acted more as an appointed cabinet than an elected body, even though they were not officially appointed, and they had all signed the secret Treaty of Dover. The Cabalists owned most of the ships sailing the trade routes, and when Charles II wanted to put their captains and crew in chains for conducting pirate business in the name of the king, the cabal proclaimed that Martin Luther said that business, not salvation, was the prime directive, and that business could be done in the name of the crown by any means necessary, but the king disagreed. To wash his hands of the matter, Charles II gave the East India Company full authority over their territories in India and gave Hudson's Bay to the Hudson's Bay Company. And Charles II started collecting taxes from all the English ships out trading on the high seas, instead of just accepting bribes from their ill-gotten pirate gains. And with this ship money, Charles II could pay the army himself and be guaranteed their protection, rather than having to go through Parliament. The Cabal balked at paying the ship money taxes, so Charles II sent his younger brother to assail the Spanish treasure ships to get their gold himself, to send to the Pope in the name of England rather than from Spain. And Charles II blamed the piracy on the Cabalists, who were refusing to pay him their ship money taxes, and his better equipped warships deprived the Cabal of their main income stream, raiding the Spanish galleons. The Cabal came up with the House of Hanover plot because they couldn't murder the Catholic at heart Charles II, because it would have been a death too far. So they married the Dutch William of Orange to Mary, the elder daughter of Charles II's younger brother James of York. And the French saw this marriage as a betrayal of the secret Dover Treaty that was supposed to help the French get Holland back to make them Catholic again. The horrible fighting between Catholics and Protestants plagued England until the Great Black Plague hit in 1665, and then it hit again after the Great Fire of London in September of 1666, when 14,000 houses burned and the rats living in them, carrying plague fleas, fled out to the countryside. The Dutch sailed up the Thames in 1667 and set the London docks on fire, and all the rats living on those ships escaped onto shore and spread the Black Death once again. And plague had been carried from harbour to harbour and kept somewhat contained in ports. But when the rats ran away from the Great Fire of London, and then the fire on the London docks the following year, the Black Plague spread far afield. After killing the king in 1649, Parliament had been made into a convention instead of a group chosen from among the king's friends. So Parliament would now be elected from the same people who were refusing to pay taxes for Parliament's army, and it had taken only 1 year after the restoration of Charles II for Parliament to be forced to give the king all his land back, as well as his own army, and Charles II resumed business as usual. The difference now was that the old generals were dismissed or murdered outright, and the Cabalists migrated into the Royal Navy, and England's wars became a tangled web of false reporting to the king about what had actually happened on and around the battlefield. The Cabal was heavily invested in the shipping business, and they didn't want the king to be able to pay for a military of his own. And they didn't want to have to pay him taxes because they knew how much it would cost and how much they would lose. Parliament was enjoying war with Spain to make the Catholics spend their money fighting England, but Parliament's primary goal remained making war on France. Charles II sent the army instead to fight Protestants in Holland, who were rebelling against France's Catholic king. And when 90 of the Cabal's expensive ships sailed for Spain to keep the Catholics from helping Charles II fight Protestants in Holland, they were met with disaster and had to limp back to the island of England in disgrace. And Charles II saw that as a sign from God. Parliament complained and refused to pay the bills, so Charles II dissolved Parliament, and the following year the Royal Navy declared war on France without asking the king, and sent ships over to help the Protestants, but the French Protestants in Holland would rather have a Catholic French king than be allied with British Protestants, so the Dutch told the English to go back home. Louis XIV and Charles II were cousins, and Louis XIV would be the King of France for 72 years. And his mother was Anne of Austria, whose own mother was an Austrian married to the King of Spain. So Louis XIV had wanted to be elected the Holy Roman Emperor after his victory at the Battle of the Dunes on the 14th of June in 1658, which had also been called the Battle of Dunkirk. And in the secret Treaty of Dover in 1670, Charles II told Louis XIV that he could have a great deal of money to send French troops over to England to do what they could to force the Cabalists to repent of their evil ways and become Catholic again. James of York had converted to Catholicism after the Great Black Plague of 1665. And when his brother Charles II died in 1685 and James the Duke of York became James II, He refused to go to war with France in 1687, and Parliament counted the days until they could welcome a different sovereign onto the throne. James II was 51 years old when he became king, and his wife had died in 1671 without giving him any male children, and he'd married again 2 years later in 1673 to a 15-year-old Italian Catholic girl who had suffered a series of 10 stillborn children, although one girl had lived for a few years, and the final pregnancy had been lost 4 years earlier. The year after James II became the King of England, Parliament held its breath when James II's young Italian wife bore him a son in June of 1688, and that meant the next in line for the English throne would be a Catholic. So Parliament started a rumor that the baby was not actually his, but had been placed in the cradle, another supposititious child, and this boy would be called the Great Pretender. The birth of that male Catholic child made Parliament swear to get rid of James II, who'd been helped to the throne by John Churchill of Marlborough. But Marlborough-Churchill would betray James II by going over to Holland to help Orange William III come over to invade England, and James II was so distraught about Marlborough-Churchill betraying him that James II fled broken-hearted to France in 1688, and he threw the Great Seal into the River Thames on his way out. For many years, English people had been disenfranchised and ostracized or murdered outright, secretly and in public, to free England from Catholics and their Pope. And the struggle was bitter because it became a question of loyalty to either the king or to the Cabal or to Parliament, and Charles II had proclaimed his Royal Declaration of Indulgence in 1672 to get the Protestants and Catholics to stop fighting, but Parliament fought him over it and voted for their own Test Act in 1674 that made all parliamentarians swear they were not Catholics and required that they declare in public that the communion wafer was not the actual living body of Christ. The Great Pretender was both a Catholic and a friend of France, and in November of 1688 the Dutch Prince William of Orange landed in England with an army, and James II fled into exile. William of Orange had been married to James II's oldest daughter, Mary, and William and Mary were crowned as co-rulers and immediately declared war on France, which would last for 8 years, and Mary would die of smallpox before it was over, and William passed in 1702, at which time James II's second daughter, Anne, became queen. The Protestants had let James II go into exile because killing him would have made him into a martyr, and the two-faced Marlborough-Churchill was immediately put in charge of organizing an English army to fight France, because the French thought that the Great Pretender should be the King of England rather than William and Mary. But on the way to the battlefield, William died from a fall from his horse, and so Anne became queen over what was now the House of Hanover, and Anne would reign until 1714, when she would die on the 1st of August at the age of 49. Queen Anne had been married to George of Denmark-Hanover, but none of Anne's 17 children would survive her, and the Act of Settlement overrode the Great Pretender and decreed that the son of Mary Queen of Scots, James VI, the first Scottish King of England, would now be the line of descent for the crown of England. James VI's daughter had a daughter who gave birth to a son in 1660 in Hanover in the Holy Roman Empire, and this son, born in 1660, was George I of the Duchy of Brunswick-Lüneburg of Hanover, and he became the first English king from the new House of Hanover in 1714, when he assumed the throne as the son of the granddaughter of James VI, just as soon as Queen Anne was dead. George I also became the first king of Great Britain, so the English became British, and the powers that be were more than glad to have a fresh infusion of healthy German blood injected into the weak English line of infertile sovereigns, and George I would sit on the throne for 12 years, and his son George II would be king for 33 years, and George II's grandson George III followed George II to wear the crown for 59 years, and he would lose the American colonies for Britain. The House of Hanover had gone to war with Spain as soon as Anne was seated as queen, and they took Gibraltar away from the Catholic Spanish, but public sentiment had turned against the war by 1710, so the Treaty of Utrecht was signed in Holland in 1713 that had been a separate peace, and it gave the British the sole right to import African slaves to America for 30 years, called asiento, and the Treaty of Utrecht was signed right down the river from Arnhem. Utrecht was where the Orange William had built a castle for his English Queen Mary that still stands, now called the Castle of Sleeping Beauty. And Utrecht was 20 miles away from where the Rhine and the Meuse come together. And because the Treaty of Utrecht forced France to recognize the House of Hanover, the British could now stand up to the Pope to claim that Frederick the Great had the right to take away land promised to Maria Theresa by the Pope, namely Silesia. The reason behind giving Maria Theresa's land to Frederick the Great was to get Prussia to help defend the British in Hanover from the French, and that would become the cause of the 7 Years' War, 43 years later, also called the French and Indian Wars in America. The 7 Years' War was fought under George II, who would be the last British monarch born in northern Germany. And George II's father, George I, had been a German who spoke no English. George I had married a rich German woman in 1682, and George II had been born the following year. And with the new German blood strengthening the sickly royal line, the Cabal hatched the House of Hanover by opening the Bank of England in 1694, and the primary purpose of their Act of Settlement in 1701, creating the new House of Hanover, had been to exclude Catholics from the English throne. When the Act of Settlement recognized the beloved Scottish Princess Sophia and her descendants, British sovereigns would now be allowed to wear the crown because they were Protestants, with daughters having precedence over uncles. James VI-I's granddaughter Sophia died in 1714 at the age of 83, and 2 months later Queen Anne died at the age of 49, and George of Hanover became George I, whose child George II would produce 7 healthy children with his robust German wife. The 1772 Royal Marriage Act would prevent any possible royal under the age of 25 from marrying without permission from the Crown, and when Ireland was added to Great Britain in 1801, Catholics were not allowed to vote. To begin the new House of Hanover, the British national debt was commenced in 1693 with a loan of $1 million made to a man named Montague, that he used to open the Bank of England, and millions more were borrowed from some rich English lords who became the officers of the bank, and they would make money on business ventures that borrowed money from the bank while the interest would be paid by taxes collected from the English people. Previously, the Crown had banked with private goldsmiths, but now the Bank of England would handle the Crown's money, and the bank was directed by people indebted to that handful of rich English lords. The Bank of England was dedicated to keeping the Crown's money away from the Pope, and after the Act of Settlement created the new House of Hanover, Britain went to war in 1717 with Spain for 11 years to enforce the Treaty of Utrecht that had resulted from the separate peace when the British abandoned their Dutch and Austrian allies on the battlefield. At Utrecht, the British took Gibraltar away from Spain, and Holland was given to Austria, and England won the sole right to import African slaves to America. The common English became fed up with the taxes needed to finance the war with Catholic Spain that ended in the Treaty of Utrecht, and by the time the Act of Settlement was signed, the British national debt was £16 million sterling. The silver coinage created at Stirling Castle had begun the reign of England's currency stream known as the Age of Silver, and thereafter a silver spoon suggested inherited wealth and high social status, and a silver lining meant something that offered hope in an adverse situation, and a silver bullet was a magical solution to a problem, and a silver cord was the magical bond between a mother and a child. The silver standard made trade and business possible all around the world, as far as the seven seas could carry sailing ships, and everyone would continue to trade in silver, even though the House of Hanover switched to gold in 1704 in the British West Indies that included Bermuda and the Bahamas. After the Napoleonic Wars, Britain adopted gold in Australia and South Africa, but not in North America or India or Oceania. And in 1873, Germany and America went to gold, and just before the Great War broke out, only China and Hong Kong and Wei were on the silver standard, and Wei was in the Shandong province and had been called Port Edward. The House of Hanover got off to a bad start with the South Sea bubble, and after the South Sea Company's board, the House of Hanover got off to a bad start with the South Sea bubble after the South Sea Company's board promised to make payments to the Crown towards paying off the national debt in exchange for sole trading rights in the South Seas, and the price of shares of stock in the South Sea Company rose 1,000%, then burst to fall to 170% of their original worth, and the small investors who had joined in the bubble were ruined. The following year, the First Lord of the Treasury would be called the Prime Minister in hopes of restoring confidence in stock trading, and he put the directors on trial and forced them to sell a portion of their land in order to pay back some of the investors. The Act of Settlement in 1701 had quickly been followed by the Act of Union between England and Scotland, and that had created Great Britain. And the constituting of Great Britain had been made possible by the Scottish Darien scheme, which means Tallinn, China. Darien, D-A-I-R-E-N, like Darien. Darien scheme, which means Tallinn, China. T-A-L-I-E-N, Tallinn, China, where a group of Scots had wanted to get into the opium trade in 1699, and they'd started a little settlement in Darien. But the British East India Company and the Dutch shipping companies complained to the English king, Orange William III, and he refused to defend the Scots in Darien against the Spanish, so the trading venture had died a natural death. The Scots swore to not honor the promises in the 1701 Act of Settlement unless the Crown sweetened the pot with some more pledges of added freedom for Scotland, and so more promises were made from the Crown, but the Scots would have to wait for their fulfillment until after the Highland clearances. As soon as George I was seated in the new House of Hanover, he signed the Riot Act in 1716 that declared no more than 12 people could gather together for more than an hour under threat of jail or worse, and jail was bad enough. And they also passed a law letting Parliament avoid elections for 7 years because there was too much rioting, especially from the Scots. As Britain was announcing the Act of Settlement, Russia surprised everyone by marching into Poland and Denmark and Upper Saxony in 1721 to kick the Swedes back into Sweden, and the Royal Navy had agreed not to interfere if Russia allowed the House of Hanover a presence in Silesia, so certain British could sail up the Vistula River unmolested to reach properties owned by the Cabal. Poland's monarchy had ended in 1572 when they refused to let a girl child ascend to the throne, and thereafter Poland had elected only kings. And when Augustus II of Saxony tried to change the agreement with Peter the Great about Silesia in the war between Russia and Sweden, Poland would be partitioned by Prussia, Austria, and Russia in 1772, except for Silesia, that remained under the auspices of the House of Hanover. Poland would be made separate again at the Congress of Vienna in 1814, but remained mostly under Russian authority, and that veneer of independence would vanish in 1832. When the Hanoverian king, too, became the King of Great Britain in 1727, the national debt was no longer being buttressed by the South Sea Company, so the Treasury's prime minister put a severe tax on trade, and anything coming in or out of England was charged a hefty tax. And then when it sold in England, it was taxed again, and the English rioted and broke smugglers out of jail and hung agents of the crown in the public square. To get even with his subjects, George II declared war on Spain, claiming that English trade to America was escaping the tax by unloading ships in American ports that were owned by Spain, and he accused Spanish pirates of stealing from English pirates. This war of 1739 was called the War of Jenkins' Ear because an English sea captain named Jenkins told Parliament that his ear had been cut off by Spanish pirates, and the British lost this war, which went on for 3 years, and so they set up Maria Theresa's War following the obvious British defeat in 1742. And Parliament forced the Prime Minister to resign for wanting to make peace with Spain. In Maria Theresa's War, Spain would lose against the combined warships of England, Holland, and Austria, and Spain's ally was France, along with Prussia's Frederick the Great. Maria Theresa's War was because the Austrian Habsburg Holy Roman Empire was in danger of coming to an end in 1740 because only a girl child named Maria Theresa was left to succeed to the Austrian throne. But only males could become the Holy Roman Emperor, so Europe went to war over the Austrian succession. Britain sided with Maria Theresa, saying that female monarchs had given England great prosperity, but the British mainly wanted to spite the Catholic Holy Romans, who excluded female rulers, and France allied with Prussia against Maria Theresa because France was fighting Britain over supremacy of the seas and over a French presence in America, and Spain joined in to uphold their staunch Catholicism against Maria Theresa and her beloved Silesia. After 8 years of the War of the Austrian Succession, the Treaty of Aachen was signed in 1748, and Maria Theresa was allowed to become the Holy Roman Empress. But she lost her lands in Silesia, whose coal fields would turn Frederick the Great's Prussia into a great power. The 1748 Treaty of Aachen gave Silesia to Frederick the Great in exchange for his being beholden to fight alongside the British in 1756 for the 7 Years' War to smash the very allies he had just worked with during Maria Theresa's War 8 years previously. After all, England had just spent £54 million to fight for Maria Theresa's right to have her husband from Lorraine become the Holy Roman Emperor, with Maria Theresa allowed to tag along as the Holy Roman Empress, and now England wanted to be paid back. The weird thing about the Scots during the War of the Austrian Succession was that they took to arms in 1743 while Britain was busy fighting elsewhere, and the Scots asked France to send the fleet over under the command of the son of the Great Pretender, and he put 15,000 French soldiers into the ships, and when they'd almost reached England, a storm blew up and scattered the fleet, and this 1743 military action put an end to the Stuarts when the British cleared the highlands of the Scots in retaliation. The War of the Austrian Succession over Maria Theresa from 1740 to 1748 was just one phase of the war between England and France over supremacy of the sea routes to India and to China. And after the War of Maria Theresa's Austrian Succession and its sequel, the 7 Years' War, Britain had no remaining friends in Europe to help them subdue the Americans in 1776. After Maria Theresa died in 1780, the Congress of Vienna let Austria keep the lovely port of Trieste, so the Austrian navy could have access to the sea, and Britain refused to sign at the Congress of Vienna, which had been the first actual global trade convention. The capital of the business world was now Vienna, the Constantinople of the North. And Vienna was at the crossroads of commerce, where the Danube River ran away into the plains, stretching all the way to the Russian steppes. At the Congress of Vienna in 1814, Paris was no longer the center of the universe, left behind from its heyday with all those great Roman roads radiating out from the city to connect Paris with all the capitals and ports of Europe. Now sea power had become the primary means of both transportation and shipping, and military men were transferred around under sail rather than over roads using horse-drawn carts and carriages. And in the emerging age of sea power, control of Hanover meant that the British could keep Russia out of the North Sea as long as the Danes went along, and Denmark was considered a friend of Britain because Queen Anne's husband had been Danish enough. The British had destroyed the Danish Fleet in 1807 to keep it out of the hands of Napoleon, just as they would destroy the French fleet to keep it out of the hands of Americans in 1942, and Britain's support of Vienna's neighbors, the Hungarians, had helped to bring about the Year of Revolutions in 1848, the year the British Army stripped Ireland completely empty of food in order to feed the army, protecting British interests from revolutionaries. The Italians, who had started the revolutions in 1848, would ally with Frederick the Great's Prussia in 1866, and Bismarck gave Austrian land around Trieste to the Italians just to punish Austria for having allowed the Hungarians to get out of hand. Bismarck made Berlin rather than Frankfurt the capital of Germany in 1871, and when the French surrendered at Sedan, the French king's wife fled to England. The Austrian emperor's brother Max had been assassinated 4 years earlier in Mexico in 1867, and the Austrians sat out the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 because they no longer trusted the French. The 7 Years' War had been England and Prussia fighting France, Austria, Russia, Spain, and Sweden. And in the 7 Years' War, Frederick the Great and Britain were victorious allies. And the big victory for the British during the 7 Years' War had been at the Battle of Minden on the 1st of August in 1759, when the French were severely beaten by the Hanoverians and their English troops. Minden was 30 miles east of the capital of Hanover, and the British celebrated the Battle of Minden because it commemorated the death of Queen Anne on the 1st of August, whose passing had brought on the seating of the first Hanoverian king of Britain in the new House of Hanover, which had given the line of British succession those dynasty-saving German genes in 1714. The Great War would begin exactly 200 years later, on that same day that Queen Anne had died on the 1st of August, the same day when the Battle of Minden had been the turning point for the British to win the 7 Years' War, allowing them to remain the uncontested ruler of the seas where the sun never set on their empire, and the Great War would cost Britain over $35 billion, and more people would die of starvation in Russia from the war with the whites that followed the Great War into the motherland than would be killed in combat during Hitler's war. During the Great War, the Russians didn't kill their own Tsar on the 17th of July in 1918, but had to hire Austrian mercenaries to do the job for them because the thought of killing their blessed sovereign was abhorrent to even the most revolutionary Russian. When Russia won the war with the whites, the Reds were condemned to be cut off from trade with the English-speaking world for the next 70 years. And when England had been fighting Holland over control of the seas in the 17th century, Dutch goods had been much more popular because the lack of tariffs and taxes in Holland had made their prices more attractive all around the world. Because the Dutch had prospered from their good trade practices and the English couldn't compete, The Royal Navy had seized over 200 Dutch ships before the Dutch sailed up the Thames to set the English fleet on fire. Belgium had stayed friends with Catholic Spain, while the Dutch Protestants had gone along with the killing of the English king 20 years earlier, because they wanted a sympathetic Protestant on the throne of England who would allow Dutch ships to continue doing business as usual on the high seas, and the shipping business had included the transport of African slaves to plantations in the British West Indies and into Southern America. English slave ships had begun attacking Dutch slave ships in Africa and in America, and the Second Dutch War would end with the 1668 Treaty of Aachen, when France was victorious over the usual suspects on the same battlefields in Flanders and in Belgium, those unchanged landscapes that would host the same armies marching over the same roads to the same killing grounds used for both the Great War and for Hitler's war.